Okay, so now that you've had some time to think about freedom of expression and answer the questions about those three quotes, let's start talking about this topic a little bit more in depth. The first question to think about is, for whom are free speech protections needed? What I'd like you to do is pause this video for maybe 10 seconds, think about the question yourself, and then restart the video. Okay, so I hope you paused the video a little bit and thought about this question. If you think about who these protections are needed for, they're not really needed to protect views that are held by the majority of the population in a particular society. Instead, they're needed most urgently to protect unpopular speech and the speech of minorities. So that final quote that you were thinking about, I hope that you found that it was a quote from a German playwright who wrote a play about the Spanish Inquisition and the burning of the Quran, which is the holy book for Muslims during the Spanish Inquisition. And of course, he was writing this. He was a German playwright. He was writing this for primarily a Christian German audience, and he was trying to make parallels with what was happening to the Jewish population in Germany. So, in both of those situations, both for the Muslims during the Spanish Inquisition and the Jewish population in Germany, close at the time when the Nazi Party was gaining popularity, there were concerns about protecting those religious minorities who were unpopular in those communities. And so when we talk about free speech protections, we're not talking about protecting or having a lot of concern necessarily for those views held by the majority. Those are not likely to be threatened, but we do need to protect those opinions of minorities or things that are, or opinions that are unpopular. So what is the law in regards to free speech? It's the very first amendment to the US Constitution. So when the US Constitution was written, there was a group of people who were concerned that there weren't enough protection for personal freedoms in the Constitution. And so there were a total of 12 amendments that were proposed, 10 of which passed and were included as what came to be known as the Bill of Rights. And these delineate certain rights that we are guaranteed by the Constitution, and you might be familiar with a lot of these. The first one, the text is written here. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, meaning the government cannot promote or require that people follow a particular religion, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and this is what we're going to be focusing on, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Again, this is the First Amendment to the Constitution. So notice that in the First Amendment, the term that's used here is freedom of speech, and this is a term that we use quite commonly. So what do we mean when we say speech? It could be spoken word, so not spoken word as in poetry, although it could include poetry, but any word that's spoken. So speeches, lectures, anything that is again said out loud. It could include written word, books, newspapers, articles, anything that's written. It can also include symbolic speech, and by this we could mean arts, so painting, performing art, music, dance. It can also be actions. So in this picture here, you see someone burning their draft card during the Vietnam War, meaning people were protesting that they were being drafted into the army. Burning the flag is often considered symbolic speech. So it could be, again, some sort of art, or it could be an action. And for that reason, we usually refer, instead of saying freedom of speech, we refer to these things as freedom of expression, because when we think of speech, again, we think of words that are spoken out loud, and it's not necessarily just that. It's broader than that. So in terms of freedom of expression, historically, different kinds of expression have been contested, and these are the issues usually that we're grappling with when we talk about freedom of expression. So political speech let me move this so you can see it. This is, a political cartoon. So political speech that's critical of the government has a long history in a lot of societies. So any sort of political cartoon or some sort of demonstration that criticizes the current government or the leaders who are in power is considered a form of expression that has occasionally been contested, obviously, usually contested by the people who are in power or the government, who don't really like that kind of expression. So that's been a controversial topic. Blasphemy is another controversial topic. So there are many places where blasphemy, up until recently, was illegal, and there's a lot of places where it is still illegal. Blasphemy, again, is saying something against a particular religion or insulting a religion or a principle or a person important to that religion. And so, again, this has been a topic of controversy, and it still comes up occasionally in different countries, where there are people who are in favor of laws that ban blasphemy, and then there's usually more people on the other side who oppose laws that ban blasphemy. And then the other controversial matter when it comes to freedom of expression is the banning of sexually explicit materials, so obscenity, pornography. And again, different countries around the world have different laws about this. And even in our country, we have certain laws about obscenity and pornography, and which types are allowed or not, or which spaces in which they are allowed or not. So this is another category of expression that has long been controversial and a lot of people debate. Another one is threats to national security. Interestingly, especially since 9/11, which was arguably, at least in recent history, the most violent and traumatic attack on our country, people were very scared about whether something like this could be repeated. And in that fear, over the last 20 years or so, we've seen that a lot of our civil liberties have been threatened, have been pulled back a little bit. And so, this image is supposed to be a phone tapping, which we know the government has been doing to a greater or lesser extent, sort of harvesting a lot of information about our personal lives. And then either censoring that or charging people with crimes based on things that they say that the government might deem a threat to national security. So this has brought up a lot of questions about what is or is not allowed in terms of expression and national security. So if somebody says something that seems threatening, but they don't actually do it, is that worth outlawing? Is that worth an arrest or the charging of a crime? So a lot of these questions are recent, specifically because of our history with 9/11. But it's also a topic that's always been there in every sort of government or society. And then lastly, hate speech. And hate speech is a particular type of is a particular issue that we're actually going to cover more in depth and specifically, especially as it pertains to online hate speech. But again, hate speech is basically words that express hate or dislike for a particular group of people. And it typically refers to a group of people that is a minority. And it can be based on a lot of factors. It could be race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexuality, gender identity, all sorts of things, ability. So again, we're going to talk about this a little more fully and a little bit more specifically later on. So what are some of the philosophical approaches to this idea of freedom of expression? So when it comes to the harm principle, which we talked about last time, we did talk about, when we were talking about personal freedoms, how the harm principle and the offense principle are sort of along the spectrum, and especially when it comes to freedom of expression. Because it has to do with expression, it has to do with speech or written word, it's usually not a question of actual physical harm directly being done by one person onto another, but more offense or something that could lead to physical harm. So the harm principle would say that only when expressions would result in real harm, not merely psychological discomfort, would a government be justified in censorship. But there's a few issues here. One is, what does real harm mean? If it's not psychological only, is it only physical, financial? What if it's the psychological discomfort is so bad that it actually causes physical symptoms in a person? So could real harm include psychological distress? What if this expression, such as a piece of pornography, encourages rape and results in rape? Would that be considered enough? That encouragement, would that be enough to fall under the harm principle? What about expression that causes so much emotional distress that it leads to suicide? So these are some really interesting questions when it comes to the harm principle, that while something may not cause physical harm directly, if it leads to physical harm, something that we readily accept as physical harm, then should that also fall under the harm principle? Of course, the challenge is making that direct connection and showing that causal relationship, that some form of expression actually caused that harmful thing to take place. Okay. How about paternalism? So paternalism, again, is a principle under which the government acts to protect us from ourselves. The question, though, becomes, what criteria should the government use to establish what kind of harm warrants regulation or prohibition? Meaning, how are you going to decide what's the standard that the government is going to use? So, for example, something that comes up is violent video games. First of all, you have to be able to establish that video games lead to actual violence in real life, which itself is pretty controversial, and most people who have studied this don't think that that's true. But there are some people who think that it is true. So if this is going to cause, again, psychological distress to a particular person, and they're doing this in the privacy of their own home, playing these games, is this something that requires government interference because it's causing psychological problems to a person themselves, not just to others? And then finally, legal moralism, in which the government intervenes to regulate and enforce an overall moral code. And the question becomes, how is this moral code established, and what constituencies shape the moral code? Basically, who gets to decide which moral code we're going to use? The same issue we talked about when it came to personal freedoms and legal moralism. So, for example, there were some groups that thought that Harry Potter, the book, should be banned because it encourages magic, and some religious groups on religious grounds thought that that was a harmful message, or this was a harmful book, and wanted it to be banned. So again, imposing a particular view of morality based on their religion, they would have banned this book. A lot of us would think that that's not okay to do. And that could just be because we don't agree with that particular moral code. But what if it's something that we do agree with? And we do agree that something is morally wrong. Is it still justified for us to encourage a law banning it when it comes to expression? So we'll talk about this a little bit later, especially when it comes to things like hate speech and opinions that really are very odious and that all of us pretty much don't like. Now, what are some of the established exceptions to this idea of freedom of expression? Now, these exceptions, again, they're less controversial than the other topics that I mentioned, in the sense that most people think that, yes, these are established exceptions, but they're also not without some controversy. So something like causing panic. So you're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. That's the sort of standard example that everyone knows. Because while you're free to say the word fire, if you say that in a crowded theater, it causes panic, it can cause harm, it can cause injury or death. The picture here is this interesting story of the reading of this book, War of the Worlds. It's a sort of a series of stories that is in this book written by H.G. Wells. And it was being read on the radio. It's a book about sort of aliens from another planet coming to invade Earth. So it was being read on the radio as entertainment, but a lot of people didn't realize, maybe they joined the program late. They didn't realize that this was a fictional story. They thought it was an actual news report, and that was the format of the story, that it was being told as if this is actually happening. So people thought it was actually happening, started to panic, and it caused a lot of sort of mayhem in many cities. Sort of an interesting thing that happened. So the telling of that story caused panic. Now, should they be held responsible, the people who did that, for causing that panic? And again, the issue is, how can you prove that there was a causal relationship? How can you say that the person who said that particular thing is responsible for the panic? Now, yelling fire in a theater, that's pretty obvious. But if you say something and people misinterpret or misunderstand it, and that causes panic and injury and harm, is it your fault? So the reason this is controversial is not because we think causing panic is a controversial exception. We do think that most people do think that you're not protected by the First Amendment, freedom of speech, to say something that causes panic. But the problem here is what constitutes causing panic. Okay. Now, another area that we think is a pretty good exception to the freedom of expression is defamation. So again, freedom of expression, you should be able to say whatever you want. But most societies make an exception for defamation. So defamation is saying something wrong about somebody. And often the justification is if you lie or say something wrong, it could actually cause harm, usually economic harm. So if you say something wrong about an individual or a company or something like that, it can cause economic harm, sometimes physical harm to that person. And so because that speech or that expression causes actual harm, it falls under the harm principle, and we say that that's an exception, that kind of speech is not protected. There's typically two kinds of speech or expression that we talk about with defamation: libel, which is written word, and slander, which is spoken. So in both of those, if you are telling a lie, a factual lie about somebody, then that is not protected, and you can be held accountable for that. And then the other type is incitement. So incitement, where somebody does some sort of form of expression. It could be demonstration, it could be words, it could be a book, and that actually leads to crime, that the words that are being used is inciting a crime. So, this is obviously a picture of a member of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, demonstrating in and of itself, having a march or something like that is not necessarily illegal. But if they're distributing flyers and saying, let's meet at this place and bring your guns and we're going to go do this and cause this violence or target this person, that is considered illegal, because that is directly asking people to commit a crime and to cause harm. But again, if it's not so obvious, it might be hard to show a causal relationship. So if it's just a march, typically we would say, okay, that doesn't fall under this category. But if right after the march, a lot of people get really riled up and then cause violence, are we going to hold the organizers of that march responsible for the harm that occurred afterwards? So these are some tricky questions that we have to answer. There's a couple of other exceptions. One is sedition, and sedition is calling for the overthrow of the government. Almost every government has a law against this. Again, because it's like incitement of crime, but it's not just inciting crimes against individuals, but crimes against the government itself. And the same issue applies, that how can you show a causal relationship if somebody just says something against the government and that gets somebody riled up and then they do something violent? Should that person who wrote something or said something be held responsible for this other person getting excited and actually doing something? And then lastly, obscenity. So the Supreme Court has actually held time and time again that obscenity is not necessarily protected by the freedom of speech. So the Supreme Court has looked at the intention of the First Amendment, and they said when people wrote the First Amendment and talked about the freedom of speech, they did this so that people were free to legitimately criticize the government, to express their opinions, but it wasn't to protect people from being obscene. And this could be obscene language. Again, it could be like sexually explicit material. So what they're saying isn't necessarily that we can't do any of these things, but that wasn't the intent of the Freedom of Speech Amendment, that our right was being protected to protect our opinions and to not be criminalized for our opinions, but not necessarily that it's a right to produce or spread or participate in obscenity. But again, there are some complications. Can you say that that obscenity causes real harm? How do you define obscenity? Where do you draw the line? So these are all, even though these are established exceptions, there's still some questions about each one of these. So the last couple things I want to talk about before you answer some questions is, why is the freedom of expression so important, even for ideas that are odious, even for ideas that we don't like? And I'm going to have you answer this question in the next, in this Canvas assignment. When you think about this, think about the situation where, people often talk about why it's important to protect even odious ideas, because they're part of what we call the marketplace of ideas. So, of course, someone could have an idea or an opinion, and it could be quote unquote right, like maybe we agree with it or most people agree with it. It could be that the opinion is partially right, or it could be that opinion is wrong. And when I mean wrong, of course, this is subjective, but something like something that all of us or most of us would disagree with, right? So someone, again, saying something very, very racist, right? Why should we want to protect that idea? Why is it so important that we defend that person's right to express that idea, even if we find it all very, very hateful? So that's one question I want you to think about, and then I'll make another video talking about this a little bit more. But I think if you think about it, you'll also come up with some ideas about it. And then the other question I want you to think about is, what are the alternatives to censorship? So let's say there is an odious idea, but we want to protect that person's right to say it for whatever reason that you will come up with or that I will talk about later. And so we don't want to censor that person. But does that mean that we can't do anything? Typically not. It doesn't. So just because we're protecting someone's right to say something doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to do anything about it. So I want you to think about, what else could we do instead? Instead of relying or resorting to censorship, what are some of our other options to deal with ideas that we really don't like? So I'm going to pause this video here. It's been a long one, so I appreciate your patience. Go below and see the questions that I would like you to answer, and then we'll move on to the next assignment.